Good morning and welcome to the February 2021 CIECAST. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director of CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members. Today, we're pleased to share with the industry the launch of the next generation of CIECA standards. Joining me today are Andy Bober, a software engineer at Entegral and a member of the CIECA Architecture Committee, and Paulette Reed, Technical Project Manager for CIECA. As we start the webinar, I'd like to remind you that there is no verbal communication between participants and the presenters. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the questions panel on your screen, and we will answer the questions as quickly as possible. So before we get going, let's talk about what is CIECA. Now, CIECA is an association that publishes software standards for the development of APIs for the collision industry. These standards are used by companies across the industry to communicate with trading partners using a common language. Now, I've highlighted a couple of words on this slide, standards and APIs. Let's take a closer look at what those mean to ensure we're all on the same page. We'll begin with the API. The definition of an API is Application Programming Interface. So what does that mean? Well, stated simply, an API is a connection point that allows one application or system to exchange information with another. Let's say you're a body shop that wants to order parts from a supplier. You want to be able to pass a parts order from your shop management system to a parts provider system. Each system will have an API that allows the two systems to talk to each other. Now, for this to work, both APIs have to be able to understand each other, and that's where standards come in. In the absence of standards, companies could build APIs, but it's a very time-consuming and laborious process as both companies have to define all the data they will exchange, how it will be formatted, how it will be validated, and ensure the data is accurate. Standards make this much simpler by developing common language, if you will, that companies can use with confidence, knowing that all the parties using the standard are using the same vocabulary, the same context, and the same structure of information. Let's take a closer look at what constitutes a standard. It starts with a data dictionary. The data dictionary defines all the data elements that could be included in an API. It defines not only the list of data elements, but the format. Is it currency? Is it text? Is it a number? It also identifies the field size. If I'm sending you a name field that is 64 characters long and your system only accepts 32 characters, that could be a problem. It's important that the APIs on both ends of the transaction use the same definitions. The next item is a schema. Now, once you know what data elements are possible to exchange, you need to know which are required data elements and which are optional. The schema is a blueprint that defines how the data elements are organized and validated. Next is the code list, and this is one of the most valuable tools CIECA provides. Code lists are the list of variables and components that may be included in a message between trading partners. Whether it's identifying the drivetrain, trim package, parts type, repair status, or invoice type, CIECA has codes that drive these transactions. You can think of the code list as all the variables contained in drop-down lists, radio buttons, and so on, plus a lot more. And finally, support documents. We have documentation that helps software developers build APIs with the collective wisdom of years of integration and API development from across the industry. The support documents give developers a huge amount of time in standing up new APIs and ensuring it will work as intended. Taken all together, these four components comprise a standard. So what does CIECA do? Well, we are the standards body for the collision industry. We help coordinate and publish new standards on a regular basis. The standards are actually developed in committees made up of volunteers from across the industry. When the need arises to add or change a standard, we coordinate with committee members to review the issue, discuss how best to approach it, and develop standards accordingly. Paulette Reed will talk more about this in detail later in the presentation. Now, CIECA members have access to all the standards developed by CIECA and use them to develop their APIs and web services. So you may be asking, what kind of standards does CIECA develop? Well, over the years, CIECA has developed standards for a broad range of collision industry processes. First notice of loss, towing assignment, shop assignment, rental assignment, estimate, repair order, parts ordering, invoicing, repair status, rental status, salvage, valuation, vehicle titling, recycling, and customer satisfaction. Basically, it covers every aspect of the collision process from start to finish. CIECA is comprised of member companies from across the industry, and our committees that I mentioned earlier typically are comprised of CIECA members, although we have had many CIECA non-members also join our committees. Our CIECA membership, the key strength of the CIECA membership is the number of industry-leading companies from each segment that are CIECA members. Many of the largest and most innovative companies in their segment are members of CIECA. This ensures that CIECA standards are used broadly by the industry, and that for new members joining CIECA, they can benefit from the collective knowledge of the industry quickly and easily. So now that we know who CIECA is and what we do, let's talk about the next chapter in the evolution of CIECA. Today we're introducing the CIECA API Standards. This will be a complete new body of work using JSON and the OpenAPI framework. Andy Bober will be joining us in a few minutes to talk more about JSON and OpenAPI and why we've selected those technologies. But before we go there, let's take a quick look at where CIECA came from and why this initiative is a big deal for CIECA. CIECA was founded in 1994 for the purpose of developing a means for estimate systems to talk to shop management systems. The outcome of that effort became known as the EMS, or Estimate Management System. In the early 2000s, the rise of XML and the recognition that the EMS was being used for processes far beyond its initial purpose, CIECA set about the creation of the BMS, or Business Message Suite, which provides a great deal more functionality and addresses many more business functions. Of course, computers and technology never stop evolving, and so now we need tools designed for today's business needs, and that is why we're embarking on the CIECA API Standards initiative. Let's look at this evolution of CIECA in a little more detail. So we're going to go back to 1994. Computers were exploding in the industry and everyone was trying to get rid of paper-based processes. Body shops were essentially getting killed with requests to provide estimates electronically, but every insurance company wanted to do it a little bit of a different way. A group of forward-looking people within the industry realized we needed a standardized way to exchange information between the estimating systems and the shop management systems, and that was the EMS. It's important to note that the EMS was intended for only one purpose, and an EMS data file contains every piece of information contained in an estimate to be passed on to the shop management system. People realized the power of this ability and started using the EMS for everything, which became problematic. EMS files started being shared broadly across the industry, regardless of whether the recipient needed all that information or not. CIECA realized we needed a better approach to exchanging information that could be tailored to the business need. As XML came into usage in the industry, many realized it would be a better means of communicating between companies in the industry. The ability to build messages tailored for a specific purpose supported the industry's growing awareness of information privacy. It also allowed us to exchange messages as opposed to data files. Over a several year period, CIECA developed a wide range of committees to develop XML messages for every major process in the collision industry. And this is the BMS. The BMS is used widely throughout the industry and will continue to be supported for those members who use XML-based processes. Our next chapter then is the CIECA API Standards project. The goal is to support all processes handled by the BMS, but take advantage of the newer format JSON. While the BMS tailored messages to specific business needs, Many of the messages were quite large in terms of data and information included in them. JSON lends itself better to much smaller, more lightweight messages. These micromessages, as we're calling them, will contain only the information necessary for a specific transaction. This is more efficient in terms of data transfer, but it also supports improved data privacy. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andy Bober, software engineer from Entegral and a member of the CIECA Architecture Committee, to talk about why we're using JSON and OpenAPI as the basis for our new CIECA API standards. So Andy, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. So to get started, we first ask the question, what is JSON? And define it just briefly here. JSON means JavaScript Object Notation. It is a data format created by Douglas Crockford back in the early 2000s. According to Wikipedia, JSON grew out of the need for stateless, real-time server-to-browser communication without using browser plugins such as Flash or Java applets, both of which were the dominant methods used back in the early 2000s. But since then, JSON has become the go-to data format for most new APIs. As you can see on the screen here, the basic data types from JSON are string, number, Boolean, array, etc. It's that array one that I'd like to touch base on just quickly here. That array type is important because it prevents anonymous lists from being used, like the ones we have seen in some of our BMS messages. Anonymous lists are not popular among developers because they cannot be easily modeled in most programming languages. Most programming languages work best with named lists, and the array type facilitates that in JSON. This differs from XML, which does not have an array or list structure. Using XML schema, API designers have to model their own list structures, which opens up the door to anonymous lists. Next slide, please. So why JSON? JSON is easy to work with. It's readily parsed by standard JavaScript parsers, and there are wonderful parsers written in most languages. JSON is much less complicated to parse than XML because its specification is simpler. There are no namespaces to contend with, and the existing JSON specification was recently adopted by the OpenAPI 3.1 specification, which we'll cover in an upcoming slide. And JSON is widely used. As you can see on the Google Trends graph here, the interest in XML has basically declined since the early 2000s, whereas interest in JSON has increased and eventually surpassed XML. Additionally, CIECA members have inquired about JSON standards and have heard us talk in the past about converting our existing standards to JSON. Next slide, please. A few years back, we started an effort to convert the existing XML-based BMS specification into JSON schema. You may have heard me talk about that in the past at some of these webinars. The goal at the time was to keep and maintain just one specification. We were hoping to maintain the XML schema-based BMS specification and be able to produce a JSON schema version along with each release. But we found it difficult to fully test, and it didn't address some of the issues I mentioned regarding list structures. We also found that large messages in XML are still large messages in JSON. And the size of some of these messages actually prevented us from ever realizing level 2 on the Richardson maturity model, which is what you see in the graph here. Richardson level 2 model to get to level 2 involves using HTTP verbs correctly without getting into too much detail. Some of those verbs limit the size of the messages that can be used. As a result, CIECA is reviewing all messages as part of this new initiative. Much of the work that has been done to convert XML schema into JSON schema will be leveraged in the next logical step forward, which is OpenAPI. Next slide, please. OpenAPI has always used a variant of JSON schema to define its messages. But with the latest version of OpenAPI, which is version 3.1, It has adopted the full JSON schema specification. As I mentioned, this allows us to leverage much of the early work done to convert to JSON schema as we move forward with our new CIECA API standards. Just a quick note about OpenAPI. The name OpenAPI is just the name of the technology used to define our new CIECA API standards. The CIECA API standards themselves are not open standards. As you know, only CIECA members have access to CIECA standards, and that will remain true with the new CIECA API standards based on OpenAPI. OpenAPI has been successful for many reasons. It can be leveraged by both API designers and their tools, as well as developers and their tools. Many developer tools read OpenAPI specifications and generate stubs. This removes much of the boilerplate code that developers have had to create manually in the past. OpenAPI specifications can be stored in version control, such as GitHub or Bitbucket, which helps to facilitate collaborative development. CIECA Architecture Committee is already leveraging this type of collaboration with the existing BMS specifications, and we will continue this practice with the CIECA API specification. Lastly, OpenAPI specifications generate interactive documentation that can be published on repositories such as Swagger Hub or hosted internally. OpenAPI will simplify and streamline CIECA implementations for companies that adopt our standards. With that, I'm going to transfer it back to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Andy. That's great information. Hopefully helps people understand why JSON and OpenAPI are a really good tool set for us to go forward with. Next, Paulette Reed, our technical project manager for CIECA, is going to talk about CIECA API Standards project and how we'll be working with committees to make that happen. So Paulette, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I am going to, like Paul said, go over how committees and our standards are developed. The CIECA standards are developed by the cross-industry committees, as Paul mentioned earlier. The reason this is critical to CIECA is that we have to make sure that we have feedback from all of the impacted segments of the business to make sure that we're providing the correct data standards. The committees are composed of both members and non-members, volunteers, and we have projects are managed by the CIECA staff, and we'll go over that in more detail in the following slide. And our standards are going to be published twice a year, and usually that's in April and October. Next. Here's looking at our committees that we have active in maintenance mode and our new initiatives coming up. So to go over our most active committees, we have the Architecture Committee, and the Architecture Committee sets the guidelines and the use of our new technology, and they update our schemas and documentation for each of the releases. Our Education Committee is works with creating knowledgeable information to the industry, such as the CIECAST webinars, which we're attending now, and a Connects meeting. Our Recycled Parts and Inventory Committee is active, and they are looking into emerging technology and how that impacts them, and they are the ones that also requested the Emerging Technology Data Standards Ad Hoc Committee to help get everybody involved and answering some of the questions that they are having and moving the industry forward. Our Standards Advisory Committee, that is where all of the CIECA chairs and co-chairs meet once a month to ensure cross-communication of all of our committees, and they approve all of the charters, business plans, implementation guides, and documentation that goes out to the industry. Our maintenance mode committees, those are committees that are not actively meeting because we don't have a project going on with them. Recently moved into those committees with the calibration and scan because they completed their project in the 2020 R2 project or release. Our new initiative committees that we have right now are the CIECA Information Privacy Ad Hoc Committee. That one is still in the implementation guide mode. Don't have a scheduled kickoff meeting yet. Our Emerging Technology Data Standards Ad Hoc Committee, we are meeting there for the kickoff on March 3rd. And that committee is going to be looking at the new terminology, workflows, and data needs and data messaging of the new electric vehicle. Our parts and procurement is going to kick off on April 1st because they want to start using the JSON OpenAPI for procurement. And we had a salvage disposition is being activated March 1st, so we can review some changes to the disposition inquiry message. Next. So there's a lot of committees, and we just kind of briefly skimmed over those. And if you want more information, you could go to CIECA.com, and under the standards drop down, there's a CIECA committee descriptions. And here you'll be able to see all of our committees and be able to go to the committee page to get more information. Next. So to discuss about our committee process, the first thing that to create a committee or to activate a committee would be to have a new project proposal. Those proposals can come from a CIECA member, the CIECA Standards Development Committee, or the CIECA board. So going back to some of our new initiatives that we just talked about, the CIECA member was the one that requested the salvage disposition change. The CIECA Standards and Development Committee of Recycled Parts and Inventory requested the emerging technology. Architecture requested the OpenAPI. And the CIECA board requested our new initiative for information privacy. So once we receive the proposal, the CIECA staff will go through the proposal review and decide if we have an active committee or a committee that's in maintenance mode, or if we need to initiate a new SDC. So again, kind of looking back at the ones that we just talked about, we assigned the OpenAPI to architecture, but it was already an active committee. The salvage disposition was needed to activate a maintenance mode SDC, and the emerging technology and information privacy are new initiatives, they're new committees. Once the CIECA staff went through that and the project has been approved, we need to get the final approval from our architecture committee, for any technical approval changes. Our standards and advisory board approves all of the changes, and then if it is a new project, then a CIECA board approval will need to be done for a new SDC. Next. To get a little bit more into what our standards and development committees do, the purpose is to facilitate the implementation of electronic commerce within the collision industry. So again, this is just looking at the workflows, messages, data that needs to be passed back and forth, any new code list, our code list values. Our resources, as we've discussed earlier, are the CIECA staff, business volunteers, and technical volunteers, which can be either CIECA members or non-members. Our committee meetings, we set these up based off of what the committee needs are. So they could be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually. And we do the work inside the committee charter and the committee business plan. And those, if it's a new committee, that's one of the first things that we do is finalize the committee charter and the committee business plan. The deliverables, of course, are the CIECA standards, the implementation guides, code lists, schemas, and any of the educational guides and white pages. Next. So for committee activation, we have a lot of activation going on for this year. One of the ways is our CIECA.com, and our staff is working with the CIECA.com and Confluence. We're going to have new web pages that's going to promote our products and services, and the committees will need to look and validate all of those changes are correct. The Confluence pages are also being created to promote other products and services that CIECA has, and they will need to be reviewed. The CAPIs project that the Architecture Committee is working on right now, that will implement committees, activate them by needing them to first, like the first notice of loss is going to be the first message that we would look at. That committee will need to make sure that anything that the architecture team does falls within the guidelines that they would like and approve that. And then after we have the guidelines created by the Architecture Committee, then all committees like the parts and procurement can start their development work on the new JSON OpenAPI initiative. And hopefully we will get everybody activated at that time so that we can get those messages created. The Emerging Technology Data Standards Committee We also believe that we will be seeing new terminology, new code list values, and maybe even new code list of messages that we will need to identify and share, and that will bring each of these committees active so they can look over what is going to approve the changes and to make sure that we identify those standards correctly. And the Standards and Development Committee themselves, parts of procurement, they can say that they want to become activated to do something. And if we don't have a activation, we have the semi-annual committee meetings that are held, of course, semi-annually, so we can go over anything that CIECA is currently working on and keep everybody in the loop, even if we're not having regular meetings. Next. The standards and development, as we went over earlier, of course, we have the proposal, then the review and the approval. Once that's assigned to the SDC, the committee meetings work through the requirements, and they come up with all the standards and they agree on that. Once all that documentation is completed, we assign it for architecture review. The architecture committee reviews all the proposed standards and changes. At that time, architecture could provide feedback for the SDC, and it could go back to the SDC for some updates or changes, or they could approve it. Once the architecture committee approves it, that is when the schemas and everything is worked on, completed, and it was submitted to the QA team. When QA is completed on all the standards and revisions of every release, and once it's approved by the architecture and the QA committee, we have our release of our new standards. Next. If you want to join any of the CIECA committees, you can go to CIECA.com and go to the contact, and you could fill out that page. Or if you want to reach out to myself, Paul, or Stacy, we have our information on this page as well. And again, if you would like any new projects, if you standards, you can reach out to any of us. And thank you. I'll turn it back over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Paulette. Paulette, I think it's safe to say that with the CIECA API Standards project kicking off, many of those committees that are in maintenance mode today will need to be reactivated and will be playing a critical role in the development of those new standards, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thanks. Just want to make sure everyone got that. So Stacy Phillips, CIECA's Marketing Director, has been monitoring the webinar for questions. Stacy, have we received any questions from the attendees?
No, we haven't received any questions, but I wanted to remind everyone that the webinar was recorded and will be available on CIECA.com. So we encourage you to please share the information with your teams and reach out with any questions or to join a committee.
Great, thank you, Stacy. I would like to remind everyone that we will have another CIECAST in March. Jimmy Spears of Tractable, Raj Profile of Claims Genius, and Olivia Bedeau of Mitchell International will provide insights into the impacts of artificial intelligence and other automation in the collision industry. You can register at www.CIECA.com/CIECAST. CIECA has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit toward a professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz on its website. A link will be sent to all attendees. And finally, please follow us on CIECA social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and CIECA news. And with that, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for attending.